So what I wanted to, I guess, tell you about tonight was a couple snippets or examples from what seems to me to be sort of a fairly remarkable but also sort of inevitable trend in large-scale data analysis. And this has roughly to do with maybe the convergence of two very different worldviews on what the data are or should be, what might be interesting things to ask of the data, what might be interesting results that you see on the data, that I'm going to broadly term algorithmic and statistical. And in some sense, it's a sort of ironic. I mean, in spite of people's best efforts to resist forging this union, I think that, and many of you would probably agree, I mean, a lot of the problems that we're sort of currently facing in scientific domains, in economics and finance, in internet domains, I mean, really are so sort of interesting or important or compelling from either a business perspective or an academic perspective or an intellectual perspective, whichever perspective you find most interesting. I mean, they're so compelling that I'm really forced to, to try and engineer this union. And so, for example, if you look at, just to take a particular example, if you look at ACM's KDD meetings, this is the top data analysis meeting hosted by the ACM, and you look at the papers that appear there now versus, say, 10 or 15 years ago, what I think you'll see is a real shift away from things that are broadly database management sort of issues and towards things that may be broadly categorized as statistical. And that could be card-carrying statisticians developing statistical models, or it could be computer scientists coming up with some graph algorithm and proving some results after making some sort of assumptions on the network participants or whatnot. And vice versa. I mean, I think you see the same thing. There's an increasing emphasis on computation within statistics and the natural sciences. Of course, the extent to which academic statistics per se is going to defer on this and just maybe define itself as sort of the span of its tools, machine learning and other areas are sort of picking up the ball and filling in the gaps. So what I wanted to talk about tonight was a couple particular examples of this. I've been thinking about this for a number of years now. I should point out, my PhD was actually in computational statistical mechanics and did a lot of work on Monte Carlo and molecular dynamics of water and water protein and DNA-water interactions and that sort of thing. And then for a range of reasons, after the dissertation, moved to do a lot of work in theoretical computer science on the theory of randomized algorithms for very large matrices. And one of the things that really struck me in that shift was that there was this sort of deep disconnect between the two areas. On the one hand, in computer science, we have this remarkable infrastructure of tools, whether it's complexity classes or algorithmic theory or data mining tools or database management systems, and all that sort of stuff. And yet, on the other hand, it seems, and I think this is probably less true now than 10 or 15 years ago, but still to some extent, I mean, there seems to be this sort of remarkable ignorance on the one hand, and partly as a result of that cavalierness, when it comes to ways in which the data can be ugly or nasty or ill-structured in a range of different ways that really affect the ability of the downstream analyst to make useful domain-specific assumptions about the output of all these algorithms. So what I wanted to do today was talk about two particular snippets. One of these is going to come from genetics, DNA Snips, single nucleotide polymorphisms. And SNPs are of interest to geneticists for a range of reasons. Geneticists are interested in population histories and interested in personalized medicine and a range of other things. And the other snippet's going to have to do with finding good clusters or communities in a large social or information graph. And this is of interest in a lot of application areas, and in particular in internet advertising. And in both of these cases, there was a particular applied problem to be solved that the geneticists or the internet practitioners were interested in. Which was, in some senses, pretty subtle or tricky. But in order to solve it, and in one case in particular, to solve it qualitatively better and differently than could have been done otherwise, we really had to sort of walk the fine line between understanding the algorithmic issues and the statistical issues, and in particular, understanding the statistical issues implicit in worst-case algorithms in order to make very strong domain-specific assumptions. And so I'm going to try, I guess, or not try, but probably sort of make everyone sort of a little bit unhappy, because I'm not going to focus on the genetic issues per se, or the internet issues per se, or the underlying theoretical issues per se, but try and sort of walk this middle ground and give you a feel for sort of what was going on underneath the hood And the reason is I think that at least as important or interesting as the particular domain-specific conclusions that was drawn in these cases is an understanding of what was going on under the hood in terms of understanding the statistical properties implicit in the worst-case algorithms is maybe a much more general paradigm that in a lot of very large-scale systems will allow you to be able to answer questions in sort of a qualitatively more refined way than you could just by using one method or the other. So I mean, we really are in this sort of situation where you're looking at the data and you sort of see what you look for. And so the question is, can we try and take one or two of the blindfolds off and have a bit better understanding of what the data looks like on its own terms? And to do so, maybe try and understand the strengths and weaknesses of the algorithmic and statistical perspectives. So to put maybe slightly more meat on the bones, if you're a computer scientist, and if you've worked with enough data, maybe you don't view the data this way now, but you were probably trained to view the data as sort of a record of everything that has happened. It's every transaction at Walmart in the last month. It's every click at a given web page. It's just everything there is. It's a record of everything that's happened. And the goal is to process the data to find interesting patterns and associations. All right? And this usually boils down to something like a frequent item set problem, which is going to be computationally hard in the models of data access that are appropriate given the size scales of the data. And so the goal then is to develop approximation algorithms under various models of data access. So this interface is very clean with database management systems and association rules and the like. If you are a statistician or trained in an area where strong domain-specific assumptions can be made, natural sciences, for example, in a lot of cases, the data are very valuable, but they're not everything there is. I mean, in particular, data are a particular random instantiation of some underlying process going on in the world. They're very valuable because they're the only insight that you have on that process. And the goal is to extract information about the world from the noisy data. And so to do this, you want to make inferences by positing some model that describes the variability around the mean and the mean structure. So these perspectives are very, very different. I mean, in one, the data is everything there is, and you want to chew on it, and the data is probably big enough that you want to chew on it fast. In the other, you're using the data to make some claim about the world. So they're very different, and they lead to a lot of different questions about what might be interesting and what might be an interesting problem to ask, how you validate interesting results. They're certainly not incompatible, and so I'm going to give you a couple examples of that tonight, but you should probably know by now, I mean, I'm sure most of you do, that they're certainly not incompatible. I mean, a couple of my favorite examples, and you could probably put 3 other examples that would be your favorite, but a couple of my favorite examples are that statistical and probabilistic ideas are central to a lot of the recent work on developing randomized algorithms for matrix problems, and I guess you'll hear a little bit about this next month at Andrea's talk. Intractable optimization problems on graph and networks yield to approximation algorithms, and you make some sort of assumptions about the network participants. And in boosting, which is a certain statistical technique, the computational parameter, say the number of iterations, can also be viewed as a smoothing or as a statistical regularization parameter. So there's a subtle interplay there. Now, 2 very common ways to think about data. So there's a lot of situations where you want to model data in other ways, but 2 very common ways to model the data are the following. And the reason these are going to be 2 very useful and common ways to model the data is that in some sense they provide sort of a nice sweet spot between descriptive flexibility, statistical descriptive flexibility, and algorithmic tractability. So a trade-off there. And those will be graphs and matrices. So you might model, I mean, the data are just whatever they are, a bunch of clicks, a bunch of snapshots of an image, whatever it is. And so you want to model the data in some way. So you can model an information graph or a social graph with a graph where the vertices represent some sort of entities and the edges represent some sort of interactions between those entities. You can model the data as a matrix. I mean, a matrix provides a natural structure for encoding information about m objects, each of which is described by n features. And not surprisingly, when graphs and matrices arise in this way, the questions that you might want to ask and the things that you'd think are interesting are very, very different than would arise in traditional applications of graph, in traditional contexts of graph theory or linear algebra, numerical linear algebra. So Greg mentioned the MMDS meeting that we started some number of years ago, and I'll put up a slide at the end to describe that in a little bit more detail. So if the sort of stuff I'm talking about tonight is at all of interest to you, then that meeting may very well be of a lot of interest. So this meeting, something we started some number of years ago to sort of address the algorithmic, well, now it's to sort of address the algorithmic and statistical foundations of large-scale data analysis. But its genesis actually was exactly in these questions. The issues that arise are very different when the matrices and graphs arise in large-scale data analysis than when they arise in other applications. And so, long story short, a couple of years ago I got to know Gene Golub, who, as some of you may know, had done a lot of work on numerical linear algebra. And I was working on random algorithms for matrices at the time, and I said, Gene, why don't we organize a specialty workshop, 50 participants, a specialty workshop to address matrix problems from an algorithmic perspective and from a numerical perspective, motivated by a lot of these data problems that we're seeing in scientific and internet domains. So we were a victim of our own success. Rather than having 50 participants, we had 230. And so we decided, it was clear that we had sort of tapped a sweet spot that the existing areas were not serving. And so we decided to run it again and again, and we'll have another version in June. And I'll put up a slide at the end about that. But in particular, in numerical linear algebra and scientific computing, matrix factorizations are used to express a problem in such a way that it can be solved more easily. Whereas in, say, theoretical computer science and a lot of areas of statistical data analysis, it's used to represent structure that may be present in a matrix obtained from object feature recognition, sort of hypothesized structure that might be there. And so, that will lead you to ask very different questions about what might be interesting. Optimal conditioning versus backward error analysis on the one hand, and questions about pass efficiency or data access on the other. So what I want to talk about tonight will be two particular examples, as I said, one from genetics and one from internet applications. So both of these arose because of problems with sort of the existing, the solution that we came at arose because of problems with the existing machinery in terms of what the algorithmic tools that were available and our understanding of them. I hope that you'll see that there'll be a lot of sort of applications of these things in very large-scale systems. But I think to develop the tools, the methods for large-scale, algorithmic and statistical methods for large-scale data analysis, you can't be working on something so obscenely big that you can't even put it on one machine. So actually what I'll be talking about today, we've developed, you can put it on one machine. So in that sense, maybe it's medium scale, not large scale. But very much in the background is stuff that's in distributed environments or in other sorts of very large-scale environments. I'm not going to, though, focus on these sorts of rubber-hits-the-road issues that, that clearly, are going to be important if you want to extend the sort of stuff I'll be talking about to stuff that's an order of magnitude or two large, or multi-core, multi-processor issues, map-reduce issues, and so on and so forth. These results are very much in the background. We have some ideas on that, and I'd be glad to talk with anyone offline. So, I'd like to talk first about a genetics application. This was something that I started a while back when I was at Yale with some people at Yale's medical school. And then about an application that grew out of some stuff in internet advertising. So on the one hand, these two will be disjoint. So you can listen to one and not the other. But on the other hand, they'll be complementary in that the lessons learned from one will be complementary with respect to lessons learned from the other. And actually, the latter application grew out of sort of a failing of the tools of the former to work in internet applications. So if you think back to LSI, latent semantic indexing, which uses PCA and SVD and those sorts of tools, and I'll say what those are in a minute if you're not familiar with those. They'll allow you to model data to a certain level of sophistication, and at some point you're going to hit a bottleneck. And so these will be a set of tools that will be able to, we had to basically invent to be able to do this in a sort of qualitatively more sophisticated way. So this is all of sort of the relevant genetics on one slide. So how do you put all of human genetics on one slide? So hopefully most of you have heard about the human genome. So the human genome is on the order of 3 billion base pairs long, spread over 23 pairs of chromosomes, order of tens of thousands of genes. The vast majority of this stuff is unknown. It's called junk DNA, and that's essentially an expression of our lack of understanding or ignorance, because there's a lot actually going on there. It's just that we don't know what's going on. So that's the human genome. Of interest in a lot of applications, not surprisingly, is the differences between any two particular people. When you go to the doctor and you're sick and your next door neighbor is not, you might want to know to what extent is that an environmental factor versus to what extent is that a factor that is in your genes. And so there's a range of types of polymorphic variations. Maybe the most common and most amenable to very large-scale data analysis is something called Snips, SNP. So single nucleotide polymorphisms are known locations in the human genome where two alleles out of A, C, G, and T are observed. So you have your 46 chromosomes, here's one piece of it, and here everyone has the same base pair. Every human has an A, and every human has a C here and T here. But at a certain spot on the order of 1 in 1,000. So depending on how you define the minor allele frequency, there's on the order of millions of SNPs. Some non-negligible fraction of the population has a C, and some non-negligible fraction of the population has a T. And the hope is that by analyzing the differences between these, you can get a better understanding of human history in terms of the demographics of population genetics, of what makes things peculiar to you in terms of personalized medicine succeeding or failing and the like. So, I mean, these are sequences of base pairs. So to apply these sorts of techniques, and the state of the art in the area at the time was to find good SNPs, and there was a range of ways it could be done. Certainly not the only, but one of the more robust and more successful is to model this as a matrix. So we have individuals. If you're familiar with Hapmap, that's on the order of 400 by millions of SNPs, but there's a lot of other data sets where this is much more balanced. Individuals by SNPs, and you might encode the data as, say, a +1, 0, -1, depending on whether you're homozygous for the major allele frequency, heterozygous, or homozygous for the minor allele frequency. So we're modeling it as a matrix. And the usual modus operandi that existed in the area, and more generally, not just in genetics, is if you're going to model the data this way, if you're modeling it as a matrix, the natural things to talk about are things like eigenvectors and eigenvalues. So the usual MO in applying these sorts of matrix algorithms in a lot of other areas is to write the gene, if you're doing microarrays or SNP data, as an M by N matrix, and to do SVD or PCA or any of a range of other manifold-based or nonlinear kernel dimensionality reduction techniques or whatnot, and get a small number of eigenvectors. And then either interpret the eigenvectors as meaningful in terms of the underlying genes and SNPs, or use some heuristic to get actual genes or SNPs from those eigenvectors in order to pass them to the geneticists so they can type them or they can do whatever they want. Now, the problem is that eigenvectors are things that you can define for any matrix whatsoever. I mean, they're not meaningful per se in the genetics applications. I mean, they may be meaningful given domain knowledge, but per se they're not particularly meaningful. This is reification in statistics, and you're on very thin ice if you're doing that, and that's well known in certain areas, but not well known in others. So in particular, eigensnips, let's call them eigensnips, being linear combinations of, in general, 3 million SNPs, although you can cut the data up in different ways, are not things that can be assayed. You can't give it to the biologist down the hall and say, will you assay this eigensnip, whereas you can give him 50 actual SNPs to assay. Nor can eigengenes be isolated and purified, nor do you care particularly about how eigenpatients respond when you walk into the doctor's office and ask for treatment. You care about a particular patient. So the common task in this application area for population and medical geneticists is to find a small subset of actual informative SNPs, actual segments on the DNA, to cluster individuals depending on their ancestry to determine predispositions to diseases, ... a bunch of other things. So as I said, I'm not going to go into the genetic details, but I'll leave it at that. Now I'll sort of abstract away maybe the algorithmic question that if you don't know much about the human genome, hopefully you'd see is going to be of interest more generally. The algorithmic question is, can we find the K best actual SNPs from a matrix? Where best means can we find the actual SNPs that capture the most information, that are maximally uncorrelated, whatever. And common formalizations of this will lead to an intractable optimization problem in the sense of complexity theory, meaning you're not going to be able to solve it. So we have an M by N matrix A, a rank parameter K. I want to choose exactly K columns of the matrix A to minimize this error. This is a particular norm. I'm not going to go into the details of the theorem, but this is a particular way to measure how good those columns are in the sense of capturing either the Frobenius or spectral or some other norm. So this is a very widely studied, perhaps not surprisingly, problem in numerical linear algebra and optimization. In terms of machine learning, it's related to unsupervised feature selection. Right? We're choosing a small number of actual columns or actual rows from the data matrix. And think of it, you want to get the best K documents from a document corpus, or the most representative K queries. So in terms of prior art or prior work, lots of stuff done in numerical linear algebra. And to a first approximation, all of it is deterministic. So a lot of things in numerical linear algebra actually had a very statistical flavor at root. I mean, the Eckhart-Young theorem, singular value decomposition, PCA, were published in places like Psychometrica. And then when the computer was developed and you needed to understand how errors propagated and things like that, randomization was sort of banished from the entire area. And it's only within the last few years, partly as a result of some things Janaeus and I did, and partly as a result of some other things, it's managed to percolate its way back in a non-trivial way to numerical linear algebra, the use of randomization in an interesting way. But aside from that, the 99+% is deterministic, typically greedy approaches. And when I say greedy, you need to make some rule on which column to keep. So you're running along, and each step you make some rule. Those are called pivot rules. I'll get back to that in a minute. But typically greedy approaches. Very deep connections to something called QR, in a particular rank-revealing QR. And good spectral norm bounds. Spectral norms are a certain way to measure quality. In theoretical computer science, starting with some stuff Rees, Kanan, Vempala did, and then Druneus and Kanan and I and a number of other people developed various sorts of randomized algorithms with some failure probability. The general framework is that you're not going to sample exactly k, but you'll sample more than k. So you'll use randomness and oversampling in some sense as computational resources. So you sample, say, order k log k columns. 2k might work in practice, so there's going to be a theory practice gap here. But order k log k in theory and 2k in practice. And very, very good Frobenius norm bounds. So the spectral norm is sort of a worst case norm, and the Frobenius norm is more of an averaging norm, if you know what that means. So here's going to be the sort of main structural insight that we needed in order to get the very good Frobenius norm bounds. Because in this structural insight, in order to get worst case Frobenius norm bounds, depended on a certain set of quantities that had a very natural statistical interpretation. And those quantities, it turns out, if you understand them, also have a very natural interpretation in terms of what's going on in the data. And so then I'll get back to that. Right. So there's a couple ways you can do the randomized algorithms. One is a little bit more like picking the cluster centroid, and in worst case, that gives you much worse bounds than the thing I'll be talking about. The other is biasing you towards things that are sort of outlying using the statistical quantities that I mentioned that have this basically statistical leverage scores. So there's, and that biases you in some sense towards outliers, and I'll say why that is. In a lot of cases, if you look at a data set and you choose the centroids in this way using sort of the obvious heuristic, you'll do a little bit better than a naive or you could do a lot better than a naive implementation of this algorithm that I'll be describing. But when that fails, you have no reason to know why it fails, whereas these will give a lot of diagnostics as to why they succeed and why they failed. Yeah. So what we want to do is choose columns. So we want to, and it's going to be a randomized algorithm. I should say it's not at all clear how to combine these two approaches. I mean, this was the genesis of MMDS, right, to understand these two different perspectives. And if you look at the details of the pivot rules, it's not at all clear that keeping an extra column here is going to help at all. And under the hood, in terms of the analysis here, there's something called the coupon collecting problem. So you're not going to be able to get fewer than k log k columns. So it's not at all clear how to combine these two approaches. And the obvious methods don't work. I'll tell you about a non-obvious one that does. And so what we want to do is define a non-uniformity structure over the data and then sample with respect to it. So we're going to close our eyes and sample. Now you can obviously imagine if you want to do things iteratively in a more complicated way, you can improve things. But in terms of just a very simple algorithm, define a non-uniformity structure over the data and sample with respect to it. All right? So the non-uniformity structure is going to be the following. I have the columns of A, and I might say, the columns of A that are larger, that are longer in some sense of the word, larger Euclidean norms, say, are the more important ones. And that corresponds to choosing large columns along the axis of maximal variation, which is a little bit like what you were saying. And that will give you certain provable results. That's very, very fast, actually, and works well in certain cases. But in worst case analysis, if I have all my columns pointing in one direction except one that's pointing off in this direction, I'm never going to find that using that procedure. And I want to find that. Now you might say I want to regularize and do other stuff, and I don't want to be solving this problem, but this is the problem we're solving. So it turns out in order to find this one column, we need to come up with a smarter statistic that will have a natural statistical interpretation. So let's write the best rank k approximant of the matrix A as UK sigma k VK transpose. And the point is that the columns of A are these tall things here, and those will be isomorphic to the columns of VK transpose. VK transpose are the right singular vectors. And it turns out that the Euclidean norms of those columns, so VK transpose is an orthogonal matrix, meaning that the rows are going to be normal and orthogonal. But the columns are not, right? This could be a truncated identity, in which case they're extremely non-uniform. It could be a truncated Hadamard, in which case they're very, very non-uniform. It could be anything in between. So I'm going to want to define a leverage score, I'll call it, to be the Euclidean norms of these columns. And I'm calling it leverage scores for a reason I'll get to in just a minute, because it has a very natural interpretation in terms of statistical leverage. And it turns out if you sample k log k columns according to that score, you'll get 1 plus epsilon. So very, very fine Frobenius norm bounds. But we want exactly k. I mean, if you give the biologist k log k, he's going to run screaming into the night, right? He wants exactly k. So the obvious two-phase things don't work. Choose k log k and filter back and whatnot. So here's going to be a slightly more refined algorithm that makes essential use of that statistical quantity that I'll describe in a little bit more detail in a minute, that will give you worst case bounds that I'm not going to go through the proofs of, I'll just state, and will also have nice data analytic interpretations. So in the first phase, I'm going to randomly select k log k columns according to these leverage score probabilities, these things that I've claimed that have this natural statistical interpretation. And then in the second phase, I'm going to not take these columns. I mean, the obvious thing to do is to take those columns of A and chew on them. The less obvious thing is to look back and say, I chose this column of VK transpose and this one and this one and this one. So to work with the columns of VK transpose that you chose and do QR on those columns. And it turns out if you do that, you get these sorts of worst case bounds. So those are going to be comparable to or marginally better than the existing state of the art, both in numerical linear algebra and in theoretical computer science for this problem. So we really bridge that gap in a very clean way. Numerical linear algebra is usually interested in columns of the bases they span, whereas in data analysis, you're interested in columns themselves. All right? Now, what we did back here is something that may not be necessary if you're just interested in the basis something spans. But what I've told you is that this is going to be, these leverage score probabilities is going to be an interesting statistic. And so in both of these phases, both in the initial, if you want to call it pre-processing or pre-filtering phase, I've chosen columns according to this. And then when I run the deterministic second phase, I choose a column according to that. So if you're thinking about interfacing to a database management system or something, which we did not do, what we're saying is don't just choose the larger columns or rows, but take into account some sort of subtle correlations, or in particular deconvolute the size of A information having to do with the variance and the subspace information and where that information is being sent. So how does this thing perform? So this will be the first example of how this thing might perform in practice and why there's something interesting going on here. I mean, aside from the theoretical result. So this is on a different data set, but we see similar, very similar things on the SNP data set. So the x-axis here is a quality measure, down is good. And the y-axis here, remember we fixed a rank parameter k. That was chosen some other way. The geneticists had some model selection criteria that we used. And so this has to do with the oversampling factor. So k equals 10, and we're choosing 2k, 3k, 4k, 5k, 6k. And what we see is that 1 is the scale set by the SVD. That's the best you can possibly do. If you apply QR on that matrix, you get 1.5, so a bit worse. If you forget about all this randomness, if you just do QR on VK transpose, on the structure that I've told you deconvoluted the size of A information and the subspace information, namely the variance information and where that information is being sent, you do better. You get 1.3. And that's sort of an interesting result, because never mind any randomness, you'll do better just by doing that. And I'll sort of give some intuition as to why that's the case in a second. And what you see is that if you do a randomized phase, then as a function of the oversampling factor, you'll do better and worse. And there'll be some sort of sweet spot in between. And if you're familiar with bias variance trade-offs and that sort of thing, it might not be surprising if there's a sweet spot there. So if you choose exactly k or 2k, you're going to do a little bit worse. If you keep a factor of 5 or 10k, you'll do better. And then as you get more and more, you'll do a little bit worse. So what's going on here? So I'll describe in a little bit more detail what these statistical scores mean in a slightly simpler setting. But intuitively, what's going on here is the following. So one thing that I didn't mention, I just presented one version of QR. There's actually a bunch of different versions of QR. And if you pull something off of MATLAB, the standard MATLAB implementation, that's going to be very different than something you can find in LAPACK or some package that people put together to do support vector machines that call something that they pulled off from somewhere else. So all of these are actually computing different things. And the reason they're computing different things roughly is because they make different pivot rule decisions. So different versions of QR are different, although I showed you only one. And that's obvious. But you have to be careful. It's not so obvious if you just pull something off the shelf. QR applied directly to VK transpose does better than QR applied to A. And that's because you're applying QR to this matrix that I've told you defines the relevant non-uniformity structure in the data. Intuitively, since columns are spread out. So the leverage scores, I'll show you what I mean by this, but the leverage scores bias you towards things that are going to be spread out. And the randomized pre-processing will improve things even more. Intuitively, because although the randomization is in the algorithm to give us worst case bounds, there's nothing statistical going on there. In fact, operationally, there's an implicit statistical regularization going on. And so you do better in practice because of that implicit regularization. Clearly, you need to be careful with the various parameter choices. It improves worse QR better than better QR implementations, partly because there's more room to improve, and partly because better QR implementations make more sophisticated decisions with respect to pivot rules, namely how to handle things that are poorly coupled together. So in the biological application, what you're interested in is something like the following. You're interested in having one population, population A, and this might be the Hapmap population, or something that NIH has put $100 million into generating reasonably high quality data on. You're not in that population, you're in population B. So you have all the SNP data here, and what you want to do is pull a small number of actual SNPs here, such that when you go into the doctor's office and you spit in a cup, he can type you on just those small number of 50 or 100 SNPs. And if you can get it down to 50 or 100 or a couple hundred, then the game is won. You give a couple hundred to the geneticist, and he'll filter using some genetic information a lot better than he can doing this sort of theory. So you can get it down to something like that. The geneticist will assay those. And the question is, how well, when you walk into the doctor's office, is the prediction on you given the Hapmap data? So how well does this information transfer? Can you from population A to population B? So the particular data, we looked at the Hapmap data. This data set's from something from Ken Kidd, who was someone at Yale's medical school. As I said, I started this back when I was at Yale with some people at Yale's medical school. Data sort of from all over the world, so much more geographically diverse than the Hapmap population, if you're familiar with that, but a much smaller number of SNPs actually typed. And what you have here is something that's color-coded. Darker is good, having to do with sub-Saharan Africans, Europeans, Asians, and American Indians, or Native American Indians. And in some sense consistent with known results. Sub-Saharan Africans, all the interesting stuff is going on there, and there's a lot of non-transferability. When you have the data from Europe, all the Europeans are the same, and they can tend to be able to be predicted as you march farther east across Eurasia, and the Native American Indians are very homogeneous, and they're actually pretty hard to pass information back. So validate some things that are known. I'm not going to go into the details. Made certain other predictions that weren't known that the biologists had some interest in. So we're looking at matrix, let's say 90 or 100, 400, maybe in the future a couple thousand by, say, 1 million. So even getting very basic code like QR, never mind doing something bigger and fancier in terms of a large-scale statistical model or whatever, even doing something very basic in QR, you'd be hard-pressed to get your QR code to run on a matrix that's 1,000 by 1 million. Informativeness was the state of the art. That's a certain measure having to do intuitively with how informative the SNP is. It's sort of a mutual information-based measure. So informativeness was the state of the art in the area. And the question might be, I'm telling you we're biasing ourselves towards important or outlying columns in some sense of the word. How do we compare to something like informativeness, which is a supervised measure, so it's going to be more expensive in certain senses in this particular application. So I'll get to that in a couple slides, actually. I guess I don't have the comparison of the two together. What I want to show you here, this is the, I guess this wasn't the PNAS paper, this was the PLS genetics result. I've ordered the SNPs here along with some canonical ordering, and the leverage scores along the y-axis here. And the first thing to note is that there's this incredible non-uniformity. So the scores that I'm telling you are the right scores that define the relevant non-uniformity structure really, in fact, do define a significantly non-uniform structure. So I'll say in a couple of slides how that correlates with informativeness and how that behaves in a couple other data sets, but they're very non-uniform here. So you might ask why. So to understand that, let me describe sort of what I've been calling this thing statistical leverage. So why is that, and what's sort of really going on? So I want to take a couple slides and just talk about least squares regression, because intuitively the problem of choosing a good set of columns, good in what sense? It's good in the sense that you're doing a good least squares fit, say. So just to set notation, we're looking at AX is close to B. A is very tall, so it's very over-constrained. There's not going to be a vector X that solves this. So you want to find the best such vector X. So very common in applications. Statistical interpretation in terms of the best, if you minimize the Euclidean norm of this difference in terms of the best linear unbiased estimator within a certain class of estimators. And a very natural geometric interpretation. Basically, you project the data back to the column span of A. So there's a couple questions you can ask. One is an algorithmic question. How long does it take to solve that problem? Very different is a statistical question. When is this the right thing to do? So the length of time it takes to solve it is nd squared time, linear in this dimension and quadratic in that dimension, so it's a certain length of time. In fact, using these ideas, actually, you can get a little o of nd squared by you doing a randomized pre-processing. And that's something we developed a couple of years ago, and it's been implemented by Taggart and Rockland and others, and actually performs very well on 1,000 by 100 by 1,000 matrices. So very reasonably sized matrices. But from what we'll be talking about today, there will be an algorithmic question: how long does it take? So nd squared time, and a statistical question: when is this the right thing to do? And intuitively, this will be the right thing to do in some sense when the data are nice. So the data are nice in the sense that b is equal to ax plus some error process. The error process is nice in certain senses, in which case b hat, I should have put a hat there, but I couldn't get the hat to work in PowerPoint, so I put a prime there. But that's a hat, is equal to a xop, where xop is your optimal solution, is this ugly thing times b. The reason I made the point about a hat and not a prime is that ubiquitous in statistics is they put hats there. And this ugly thing, which is actually just a projection matrix under the column space of A, for that reason is called the hat matrix, because it puts the hat on B. It gives you the prediction given the input data. So H is this so-called hat matrix. Hij, the ij element of that projection matrix, measures the leverage or influence exerted on bi prime by bj prime. So measures the leverage or influence, sort of how important the jth data point is on the ith prediction, independent of what the data vector b is, because I told you it's unsupervised. It doesn't depend on A. Relatedly, HII will measure the leverage or influence or importance of the ith constraint. And HII, since this is a rectangular thing, is just the Euclidean norms of any basis spanning that space. So I'm dealing with the left singular vectors here, so I called it a U. Since we're sampling rows, I called it V before. I hope that's OK. So I've toggled back and forth. But these are exactly the scores up to normalization, exactly the scores we saw before. So what's going on in terms of the hat matrix? So this is the original Wood data from the hat matrix and regression and ANOVA from about 30 years ago. And you actually won't find this in any of our papers because we just discovered this about a year ago, except the very recent ones. But it turns out this was a concept that had been used in statistics. And you want to say that something like this is going to be the best fit to this data, which is this kind of Wood data that's been widely studied. And if I sort of intuitively ask you which data point here is going to be the most important, if you tickle it, how is the least squares fit going to change the most? And maybe data point 4 or 3 or something would be the largest. And I don't know how good the screen's resolution is, but if you look at the entries in the hat matrix, what you'll see is that data point 4 has the largest entry. Now, years ago, statisticians said, geez, we can use this as a rule of thumb, and if any particular data point has, say, a factor of 2 more leverage or influence, that indicates that that point is particularly important in the least squares fit. And so that's not such a good thing, that you have one data point that really dominates the fit. Maybe I should come up with a better, maybe 2 things. Maybe one, this is an error. Maybe I just kicked the machine, right? And this is just a mistake, in which case you should throw it out. Or maybe I should come up with a better statistical model in order to apply to the data. So the question was, could you use some other sort of techniques in order to identify these outliers? So the goal here is to find good SNPs, and so we don't necessarily want to get rid of these outliers. This is one way to find them, and I suspect that a range of other ways. I mean, this is one way that meshes well with the theory, the Frobenius and spectral norms. If you had some other quality measure there, some other outlier detection methods may very well be appropriate, yeah. And so we haven't thought about that, and no one else has, because this is new enough. But that's a reasonable thing to think about. But we don't necessarily want to flag them as bad and get rid of them. They might be the most interesting things. Right. Yeah. So, so this is Zachary. This is a commonly studied social network in the community detection literature, and I'll get back to that in the second half of the talk. And I've color-coded it. So you see, I haven't told you what the colors mean, but a fair degree of heterogeneity in terms of the influence of each edge, the statistical leverage or influence of each edge. And this is the Enron email data matrix, 60,000 by 90,000 roughly. And you set D or K equals 10. And so the average value that you might expect is 10 to the minus 4. All right, so 10 to the minus 4 is the average value. And in statistical regression diagnostics, they say if any single data point has leverage score 2 or 3 above the average, flag it as a potential outlier. So what I've plotted here is a running total of what I'm calling the cumulative leverage. the leverage value of the highest leverage term, of the second, of the third, of the fourth, and so on. And what you see is the highest leverage guy has leverage 10 to the minus 2. I mean, obscenely outlying, a factor of 100. And it's not just that there's one of them. The next guy is only marginally less, and the next guy is only marginally less, and the first 10 guys, and the first 100 guys, and so on. So by the standards of classical regression diagnostics, you have just an obscene number of data points that are really incredibly outlying. So this is certain microarray data, not the SNP data I had before, but very similar in certain senses. And in particular, what you see is that a huge range of variability in what's going on here. This is the information gain, the supervised information gain metric, and what you see is an incredibly strong correlation here. And the conjecture, I'll call it a quasi-conjecture because it's not quite formal, is that the correlation is particularly strong in data sets that look like this. I don't know how good the slide is, where you project the data down to 2 or 3 dimensions and they cluster nicely, which is, of course, an incredibly strong selection bias, but it's very tempting because then you get a nice picture. But there's a very strong selection bias there. And so, the idea might be that conditioned on looking at data like that, you're going to get a very strong correlation between this supervised method and this very cheap to compute statistic that doesn't depend on in some sense, the class labeling. So before I move on to and wrap this up and move on to the clustering and community detection, what we've done here roughly is say we want a theorem. I mean, it grew out of a theorem. We want a theorem, so we know when it works and when it doesn't, as opposed to heuristic. We want it to work on a very particular application of interest to the geneticist who doesn't even know what a Frobenius norm is. These things are published in PLOS Genetics and Genome Research, so of interest there. And it turned out that to get the theorem, the very strong theorem, we had to use a concept that at root was very statistical and had to do a sensitivity analysis, even though we got a worst case theorem. But the data points that were so outlying are the ones that were the most interesting in the application. And intuitively, it's because, if you think about the SNPs, each SNP is a single event in human history, right? This SNP changes, boom, it goes out. And maybe population admixing or whatever, it works its way back in. But by the time it works its way back in, some other SNP has happened, and some other SNP has happened. So each of these SNPs is very poorly described by the rest of the SNPs. It's most outlying, and so it's most interesting, but it's very poorly described. And so you might ask two things. One, you might ask, why does something that's at root a statistical concept like leverage help with worst case analysis of a very traditional numerical linear algebra problem? And intuitively, the reason is if a data point has particularly high leverage and is not an error, that you didn't kick the machine, as basically worst case analysis implicitly assumes, because it just chews on the data you have and takes everything as given, then it's going to be particularly important, like the SNP that shot out because it's a single event in human history. A related question might be, why are statistical leverage scores so non-uniform? I mean, I should point out, since I guess Andrea Montanari will be giving a talk next week, a lot of the precursor to this work had to do with the randomized algorithms for matrices. The hard part is either determining this non-uniformity structure or washing it away. And so a lot of the work that he'll be talking, I don't know exactly what he'll be talking about, but that he's done, and from the title that he may be talking about, has to do with matrix reconstruction and some other things having to do with low rank decompositions. And there, the question is either identify this structure or wash it out. So in compressed sensing, you might be pre-processing with a random projection or a randomized Hadamard transform. And so the algorithmic question is either identify the structure or wash it out. What we've seen in these particular data applications, because the biologists don't want eigensnips, they want actual SNPs, is that we had to identify it. We could identify it on 1,000 by million matrices. But you may ask, why are these scores so non-uniform in many of these large-scale data applications? We saw the Enron data, we saw the SNP data, there's a bunch of others I could show you. And intuitively, I think the reason is that statistical models are often implicitly assumed for computational reasons and not statistical reasons. Right? When you're doing latent semantic indexing, so this basically you have big term document data and you do the PCA or the singular value decomposition. If you're doing latent semantic indexing, no one, well, maybe people would, but there's no reason to think that SVD is an appropriate model for term document data. Right? There's nothing on the order of the entire lexicon in any particular document. Right? Incredible non-uniformities. You don't see anything close to measure concentration or any of these nice theoretical tools that you'd expect to go through. So you may ask, why is it useful? It may be useful for statistical reasons, but it's also useful for computational reasons because it's a relatively cheap thing to compute. And so the statistical models implicit in PCA and SVD are assumed for computational, not statistical reasons. And so it's not surprising that many data stick out relative to obviously inappropriate models. So these are a couple themes that I think in terms of designing algorithms for larger scale systems will be useful to keep in mind. And with that, I guess I'll wrap up the genetics application and move on to what in some sense is a very different application having to do with internet data analysis. But so I was working at Yahoo a couple years ago at the time and was thinking about some of these matrix techniques applied to large term document data of the variety LSI and advertiser bidded phrase graphs that were at Yahoo of interest in a lot of internet companies. And the results, weren't so promising for a range of reasons. And then two different business units came to us and had very particular problems. They wanted to find clusters, micro markets, to do query expansion, to pull out the market, to do bucket testing and that sort of thing. And they were getting very strange results. And so since I was a resident matrix expert that supposedly knew about how LSI works, they came to me and I talked to them. And LSI didn't work particularly well, and a range of other machine learning and manifold-based learning techniques didn't perform particularly well. And so the question is, what's going on in these data sets? And the results seemed sort of bizarre enough that if they were real and not peculiar to those two particular data sets, it was a much more general phenomenon. So we had to go back and, in some sense, invent a range of tools where we used approximation algorithms for intractable problems as experimental probes of the system in order to try and get insight as to when there was clustering structure, when there wasn't, and so on. So lots and lots of networks out there. It's a fairly popular thing to talk about these days. And I can imagine a range of different sorts of applications, but I'm going to talk about an interaction graph model of networks. Nodes represent entities, edges represent some sort of interactions between the entities. And in a lot of situations, you'll have, say an advertiser bidded phrase application, a discretization of the advertisers, a discretization of the phrases, a link here if advertiser I bids on phrase J, and you want to mine this graph to get useful information. So what does this graph look like? I told you roughly what the SNP data look like. What does this graph look like? So this is what this graph looks like. And unfortunately, the state of the art in visualization algorithms is such that the visualization algorithms tend to reveal more about the visualization algorithms themselves than about the networks they're trying to visualize. All right, so that's a little disturbing on the one hand. But on the other hand, you can flip that on its head and say maybe we can try and look at the artifactual properties of what's going on in this particular visualization algorithm to try and understand what's going on in the data. And that's going to be what we're going to be talking about more generally. So the idea people have in the back of their mind is that this is what the world looks like. There's a gambling market and there's a sports market and there's some sort of intersection with sports gambling. And you want to know what the click-through rate or ROI is of some piece of this. You imagine some sort of hierarchical structure to sports gambling that's a little bit finer level of granularity than the gambling or sports. And the fact that I put a nice border around here is saying that I think gambling is sort of a coherent entity that I can think about and reason about, that has some stuff going on inside it relative to the surface area and what's going on in the rest of the world. So the goal is to find isolated markets or clusters with sufficiently money and clicks and sufficient coherence. So big enough that it's worth your time, coherent enough that you can pull it out and do bucket testing and reason about it as an economic entity, say. The question that's not usually asked is this even possible? Test the hypothesis that the world looks this way. So a range of methods can be applied. Linear low rank methods, if things are very nice, then LSI and the stuff I was talking about previously will work. Although not precisely defined, communities are usually thought of as sets of nodes with better connections amongst its members than with the rest of the world. So something about intra-coherence relative to inter. And there's a range of ways that can be formalized, but that's sort of roughly the intuition. So what I'm going to be talking about is robust to the particular formalization that I'm going to present here. So I'm going to be talking about something called conductance. Conductance is a combinatorially defined thing for any graph, which is roughly the number of edges crossing between conductance of a set is the number of edges crossing between that set and its complement, divided by the number of edges inside that set, roughly. Right? And the conductance of the graph is the conductance value of the deepest conductance cut anywhere in the graph. And your intuition might be if the deepest cut in the graph is about 50-50, splits the graph into two roughly equal sized pieces, then you're in a very different situation than at the deepest cut nibbles off 100 nodes, right? So what we want to do here is define a size-resolved version of conductance, because this will provide a much more powerful lens of what's going on in these graphs. Now, optimizing conductance is intractable. So certainly optimizing a size-resolved version of conductance is going to be intractable. Now, it might not be clear what the size-resolved version is. I'll put up in just a couple slides intuitively what it is. It has a very natural interpretation. But this is the quantity of interest. It's going to be intractable, so we're going to use approximation algorithms to approximate it. And in fact, there's going to be an analog here. Understanding the statistical properties that are going on inside these approximation algorithms will allow us to make very strong statements that in some sense will be approximating it even better than if we had computed exactly. So the high-level idea here is that we're going to be, the intuition is that we're going to be using approximation algorithms for this particular combinatorial problem that I told you, the best conductance set in the entire graph. And we're going to be sort of probing the graph in order to reveal insight about its clustering and community structure. So the nice thing about conductance, aside from sort of capturing the intuition of what people usually think of as a good community, is that there's a wide range of algorithms, the theoretical strengths and weaknesses of which are pretty well known in certain senses. So there's spectral approximations. If you're familiar with spectral partitioning, that's this approximation algorithm for the intractable objective. And this is good in certain cases and bad in certain other cases. And this worst case approximation is in fact achieved on certain paths along stringy graphs that confuse long paths with deep cuts. This flow-based method is a totally different approximation algorithm to approximate the same objective. And that gives you a log n approximation. And in fact, there are graphs that are that bad. They're called expanders. And a bunch of other techniques, including Metis. And so, we're not interested in, sort of dogmatically saying this is the objective we're interested in and throwing any approximation algorithm at it. What we want to do is have some objective and see how the different approximations behave in order that maybe we can make some downstream application as to what the community structure is. So the usual MO, is to define an objective, the numerical value of which is intractable to compute, develop some approximation algorithm that will approximate that number, and that's all you say. The graph achieving the approximation may be related to the graph achieving the exact optimum. There's just not much else you can say. For a lot of randomized algorithms, including randomized versions of what I had on the previous page, in particular those with a geometric flavor, you can approximate the vector achieving the exact solution, or the graph achieving that in some sense. Randomized algorithms can compute an ensemble of answers. So you can get an ensemble and look at the properties of the ensemble, and then compare different approximation algorithms for the same problem. So we're really using these as sort of experimental probes of the graph, right? So there's been a lot of talk in computer science about, now that you have the internet and the web and social networks, that this is a little bit like the natural sciences where you have a system that you can study. And this, I think, is the first example where someone actually does that, where they say we're going to use some experimental tools to probe one of these graphs to understand it. So the intuition, really is that we're doing an experiment, right? So the analogy is, what does a protein look like? And a protein is a little tiny thing that's nanometers across. And at a high level, the way people determine protein structure is to put the protein in solution or in a solid, in a crystal, and send in X-rays or send in an MR, and then measure all this junk coming out. The junk coming out isn't of interest per se, but by looking at all this junk coming out and knowledge of the artifactual properties of the physics going in, you're able to make some statements about this thing. So exactly the same thing's going on here. We have a social graph, an information graph that we can't visualize. I showed you what the visualizations look like. We're sending in spectral algorithms, we're sending in flow-based algorithms, we're sending in a bunch of other things. We're tearing the graph apart in a whole bunch of ways. We're throwing all the stuff on the floor. And then we're going to look at all this stuff using knowledge of the implicit statistical properties of spectral and flow that we're sending in to make some statements about what this thing looks like. So I've defined the size-resolved version of conductance. You can imagine doing a lot of things with the sort of general high-level description that I described. I'm just going to talk about one example of this. And this has to do with finding or trying to identify clustering or community structure. And so the size-resolved version of conductance that I talked about has a very natural interpretation in the following way. If the network happened to be a one-dimensional chain or a discretization of the plane or a discretization of three-dimensional space, this will go down. And it's because of this surface area to volume interpretation. So I didn't define exactly what conductance is, but really it's very much of a combinatorial analog of surface area to volume. So if this graph happened to have a very nice geometry with it, then this thing goes down. And it goes down just because bigger circles are better than smaller circles. Bigger spheres are better than smaller spheres in a sense of basically an isoparametric sense, if you know what that means. Now, the details, we're taking an extremal statistic. I'm not amplifying something, so don't worry, I'm not cheating there. The details of what's going on, whether this thing's choppy in certain ways and so on, that's a very non-robust property. But the qualitative property of going down is very robust. So road networks, anything that lives on the Earth will go down. And expanders don't have any deep cuts. And expanders are basically defined to be things that don't have any deep cuts. And expanders are certain types of graphs that are the least like low-dimensional graphs. And they have no good cuts. They have a lot of other useful properties in algorithms, and so people like them a lot. But that's not going to have any deep cuts. So Zachary is a small social graph that I put up a few slides ago. This has a left half and a right half, and people spend a lot of time trying to cut this guy off or put this guy on one side or another. But really, it's a two-dimensional thing, or maybe even a one-dimensional thing, right? The fact that you can put it on a piece of paper says it has a nice visualization. That's an existence proof, right? I mean, it has a nice visualization in 2 dimensions. And maybe you can argue about a little bit better spring forces or whatever. But, and that goes down. You know, Newman's community, drawn from a bunch of his bibliographies, goes down. A bunch of others. Common generative models. Preferential attachment is an expander everywhere. Look at the red. If you fit any of these models, you know, randomized models, to the probability of reproducing triangles, say, the so-called clustering coefficients, you pull things down just a little bit, but that very local information doesn't propagate to anything larger. Hierarchical models. You think there's a hierarchy. This will go down. Geometric preferential attachment in small worlds will have an expander-like region and then head down south. So downward sloping you see for a lot of small social graphs that are used for validation, low-dimensional graphs that inform intuition, hierarchical graphs that are used for model building, and so on and so on. And more generally, it's very closely related to the applicability of a lot of data analysis tools. Right? If you're going to split a graph in half and do some recursive partitioning, whether or not it's for this particular application, you're not going to be very happy if you're nibbling off 100 nodes and your recursion depth is extremely, extremely deep. So you're hoping that the graph does split into 2 nice 50-50 sized pieces. So a huge range of data analysis tools, more generally than just this community application, secretly assume that the data look like this. You know, they're on a low-dimensional space. Maybe there's some fine structure here and some fine structure here, but really they're on a plane. And so we were seeing a lot of very bizarre results with social and information graphs in the advertiser bitted phrase applications. And so we went back and looked at, on the order of 70 large, now many publicly available social and information graphs. And this is about the smallest one we could illustrate the result on 4,000 nodes. And what you see is that this profile plot goes down and down, hits a minimum, and then goes up and up and up. And the local minima correspond to things you might plausibly want to call community. There's a lot of structure I'm glossing over here. But it goes up and up and up and up. 2 other ones that are orders of magnitude larger, up and up and up. Bunch of different algorithms to cross-validate. They all go up and up and up. We can have lower bounds here. So what we have here is a situation where you have small clusters that are very good and no large-scale clustering. Now, on the one hand, that's obvious because you say, well, the world's pretty unstructured and a lot of randomized models at large scale might imply that. But if you're trying to partition the graph up with any of a wide range of data analysis tools, you're doing any range of other things, you're assuming that the data don't look like this, that this goes down and down and down, or that it's an expander. And what you saw is that all the generative models behave exactly that way. So I'm going to skip, in the interest of time, over a little bit more detail of what's going on. I mean, this is a very robust qualitative result. There's a core and a periphery in the graph, but if you tear off the periphery, you see exactly the same thing. The core itself has a core periphery structure, and so it's nested. And there's a range of ways that we can be confident in these results, but in particular, what I want to say in the interest of sort of the understanding the trade-off between the algorithmic and the statistical perspectives. So the simplest null model that will reproduce having very small clusters, but no large clusters. So people beat up on Erdős-Rényi a lot, the random graph model, Erdős-Rényi. In fact, Erdős-Rényi will do that if you choose your probability parameter p to be extremely, extremely small. So very, very sparse. So if you're more statistics-minded and don't know about Erdős-Rényi, think that we're talking very sparse. So that'll do that. And in fact, random power law graphs will do exactly the same thing. And in both those cases, they're doing that because at a technical reason, something called measure fails to concentrate, meaning you're not letting the number of data points go to infinity. But by the time you get a factor of 10 more data, it becomes noisy and unstructured in such a way that you're sort of fleshing out different dimensions of the vector space in this term document analogy. So the real data have triangles clustering. They have lots of little local structures. So you should think of it as little pockets of local structure on top of this sparse random scaffolding. So the fact that we're having a sparse random scaffolding suggests that statistical methods will be particularly useful here. But what we don't want to do is take this combinatorial objective that's already intractable and be tacking on all sorts of regularization and other terms like that, because that's going to make the problem harder. I mean, that'll give you another intractable problem that you might not even have all this machinery to approximate. So what we want to ask is there some way in which the act of doing the approximation itself implicitly regularizes? And so the short answer is yes. The long answer is a lot longer than that. But the short answer is yes. And so, for example, red will be a flow-based approximation algorithm, and blue is a spectral approximation algorithm. And spectral tends to, because of its relationship with diffusions, tend to cut off long stringy pieces. And so you tend to get things that are more rounded. But you also tend to get things that have worse conductance value. So the y-axis here, this is the size scale, the y-axis here is conductance quality. So red is clearly better. And so you may ask, why are we even running blue? But if you look at the two different metrics, this is the average diameter, and this is something else. Blue is clearly better in this regime, and I could show you flow is better in certain other regimes. So what we're seeing here is that inside the algorithm itself, we're getting an implicit regularization. And sort of pictorially, what we have here is that spectral gives us things that are maybe more compact internally, whereas flow gives us two more or less disconnected things that are just sort of pasted together a little bit. So just in the interest of time, I sort of glossed over a couple of those things. But sort of the high-level point is the following. What we wanted to do was understand something about clustering and community structure, and why the various business units were having trouble pulling out good communities. And it turns out the problem was much more systematic than they had originally suspected, and in fact applies to a lot of other data sets, not just social information graphs, but more generally. And in some sense, it's not the case that for those or any of a bunch of other sorts of data sets, you have a nice low-dimensional structure like SVD that you sample with respect to, and if you throw a factor of 10 more data at it, you just flesh that out a little bit more cleanly. The new data stick off in all sorts of other directions that have very nasty algorithmic and statistical consequences, such that if you naively apply any of sort of a range of data analysis tools to these particular types of graphs, but other data sets more generally, they tend to perform very poorly. Now, because of that sparsity and noise, so that's a very strong applied claim and sort of remarkable from the community side. I mean, that in a certain sense, there really don't exist good things that capture the internal versus external by criteria that people have in the back of their mind when they're talking about clustering in communities. I mean, more generally, it would have, I think, implications for a lot of data analysis tools because there's a locality structure here. But the way the locality structure is typically implemented secretly assumes that there'll be good large cuts, which makes it not relevant for this particular class of data, but probably more generally. Now, with respect to these particular graphs, and I suspect this is true more generally, but at least for these particular graphs, what we wanted to do was do regularization, right? And so if you want to understand the difference between algorithmic and statistical perspectives, regularization really is exactly at the heart of that difference. Because regularization sort of has to do with how smooth the data are and how robust the conclusions you want to draw are. So in a lot of vector space settings, regularization is added in machine learning and data analysis by just tacking on a norm constraint. Objective plus lambda times some norm constraint. But as I said, if you're dealing with 10 million node graphs with 100 million edges, you don't want to be making the problem harder by tacking on, like think L1 regularized L2 regression, if you know what that is. I mean, that'll make the L2 problem harder. So you don't want to be making the problem harder. You want to be making the problem easier. And so the question is, to what extent can you do that? So, so a lot of practitioners, have sort of informally seen things like this, that in some sense, if you stop your iterations early, the example of boosting I mentioned, or any of a number of others, you tend to smooth things out in certain senses, or maybe do some regularization. This is just trying to do it on graph algorithms, so we're not in a vector space, right? The data point is a graph, it's not a matrix. A lot of approximation algorithms for intractable graph problems, implicitly regularize. Implicitly meaning by the sort of very nature of the steps they make. Spectral has diffusions, flow performs well, poorly on expanders, and so there's a certain capacity control. If you know what flow is, no pun intended actually, but there's a certain capacity control in what's going on there. And so certainly in the sense it incorporates all the empirical signatures of regularization. And so the question is, can you develop that theory a little more systematically and applying it more generally? If you're imagining, there's a lot of work done in machine learning on vectors, things that are loosely described as vector space methods, support vector machines and these sorts of things. And these are analogous to SVD in that the first eigenvector is in general has contributions from every component. It's not sparse in some sense. And that's very tricky if the bottleneck is not computation but communication. You have your data spread over multiple cores or over a couple thousand processors. And so the question is, can you use insights as to the inner workings of these algorithms to say, I'm going to settle for something suboptimal in my SVM optimization or whatever, but is good enough, and then conditioned on that, say, minimize the communication constraints. There's a lot of work done on beginning to think about that stuff, but nothing that I would say really is sort of mature enough in some sense. So with that, let me wrap up. If you found this sort of stuff of all at interest, we're actually running this MMDS workshop, Algorithms for Modern Massive Datasets, again at Stanford. It'll take place on the campus of Stanford University in June. And this is something we started some number of years ago, as I said, to really look at the interface between the numerical and algorithmic perspectives on large-scale matrix algorithms, but more generally now sort of algorithmic and statistical perspectives on very large-scale data problems. And so, trying to address certain questions about if you want to do large database management systems, say, but you want to have some statistical model where you can make some claims about, an event that isn't in the database. You want to make a prediction for a given user clicking at a given web page at a given time of day and a given zip code. That may not be in your database. So you can use some sort of statistical understanding of what's going on in order to make, some very quickly, in an algorithmic sense, but very applied conclusion. So this was a very ubiquitous, from the community side, okay, so there's two things. One is the particular community application, and the other is maybe the more general implications. For the particular community application, this was a very, very robust qualitative result. The only exceptions to this, aside from the design small examples, was something like autonomous systems, where you have a graph of the autonomous systems, the connectivity structure, that's basically implicitly designed to be well connected. So any of these social graphs that have grown sort of ground up. So it's a very robust qualitative property in that sense. The edges could mean any of a wide range of things. So in some cases they were co-citation graphs, in some cases they were collaboration graphs, in some cases they were the advertiser bidded phrase graphs. There's a couple variants of that, but one was with some discretization of the universe of advertisers bid on a given phrase and the discretization over here. So there's a whole bunch of different examples. We had a few were weighted, a lot were not weighted. The ones that had directedness, since we were interested in communities, we made undirected. So we didn't look at directedness. That's sort of an open problem given by this. Time evolution is another tricky thing that we have some ideas about, sort of conditioned on this static scaffolding, but we didn't address particularly here. Right. So what we did not do, if I'm understanding what you're saying, what we did not do is sort of design the edges by saying here's a bunch of features and take a dot product or something. I suspect some of these results would port. That's a much more common thing in machine learning. I suspect some of these results would port to that setting. But in most of these settings, some notion of edges was given, given the application. And you could tweak it and you can weight it and stuff. But there was sort of a natural notion of edge given. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a tricky question. I think there's two ways to view the thing. One is, what do you want to do? And there's sort of a trade-off here between overly optimizing prediction accuracy and understanding what's going on. And in situations where you want to overly optimize prediction accuracy, it's probably just as well to come up with a dumb set of features and a factor of 10 more data. Because, at least right now, the state of the art isn't that we can't give you better features, maybe in some number of years. If you want to understand what's going on, this I think would be more relevant. And so, looking at the clustering structure, and maybe, it's not the case that that there's a nice cluster here and there's a nice cluster here in a low-dimensional sense, but this is sort of embedded in a more expander-like scaffolding. And so you can't just apply off-the-shelf tools like you normally would, because that would get lost by what's going on over here. But playing off the locality at various size scales and things. So I guess that's one point. If you want to make very fine predictions, we were just looking at the structural properties of a graph. Probably the best thing to do is also to sort of augment that with sort of extra meta information. So we haven't done the following, but I suspect it would work. If you take some notion of graph, the bitted phrase graph, the collaboration graph, whatever, and augment it with other information, demographic or geographic, you could probably tease out certain structures that are there, but not obvious given the noise properties. Yeah, so I was a little cavalier about that, and the reason I was a little cavalier is, in some sense, what I want to say is it doesn't matter. Now, clearly, at some level of granularity, it makes a big difference. But when you're saying Laplacian, I mean, if the graph is regular, they're all very, very similar, depending, the adjacency matrix and the Laplacian and normalized and not. If the graph is not regular, you can normalize. The normalization will damage a lot of the structure because it'll basically pull the large degrees back. I mean, one sort of qualitative point of this is that in a lot of these data sets, you really do fail to get good things happening, like measure concentrating. And so you have things stick out, the Snips, but also in the social graphs. And the fact that things stick out, you can easily hide by normalizing all those things back in. So, when you're doing Laplacians and normalized Laplacians, that's doing a lot of that. So if you want to get good convergence theorems in terms of statistical convergence theorems or something, you should normalize and damage that structure. Right? You should normalize that and pull everything back in, because you can't get the good convergence theorems otherwise. I mean, this thing I said about extremely sparse Erdős-Rényi means you're in a sparse enough regime that you can't let P and N go to infinity. I mean, they just don't. By the time this gets much larger, you flesh out a lot more. So I was a little cavalier about that because what I want to say is it doesn't matter at the level of resolution I was talking. But clearly, I mean, Tong Zhang, for example, has a nice thing paper where he shows, if you want to normalize not based on the sort of data mining reason where you just normalize based on the lengths, but based on some sort of statistical considerations, then you should normalize in some other way. So I think that's a bit of an art that people have been a little bit cavalier about. So that is correct. So in a sense, the fact that you have this deep, I mean, I gloss over it just so it's time, but the fact that you have a deep cut at small size, because you can view it as a graph or community thing, but you can view that as, I have a data set, I do spectral partitioning, I put it on an eigenvector, and it's an L2 measure. So the L2 measure, the intuition is half your nodes sit here, half your nodes sit here, and you cut. And that's the case if the data set looks like a hot dog and you can cut it in half. And if the data set's an expander, there's no good cuts anywhere, so you just cut whatever. If the data sets look like these graphs where you have a core periphery structure, what you're doing when you do that cut is cut off 100 nodes. And you're still satisfying the L2 constraint. But what that says is that you have 100 nodes that stick out here and 1,000,000 minus 100 that stick just on this side of 0. So the L2 constraint is satisfied. So I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. That's just the way it is. I mean, the reason we use matrices and graphs is because they're tools we knew something about. If you want to say, geez, I want to go to Banach space norms and more general things, you can do, but then the world's a much less tame place. So I think, I mean, I don't have a good answer to. What would what would regularization? I mean, one perspective you can take on these graphs is, I have algorithmic tools, and I need to know something about something to do anything. And I don't know what the graphs look like. So what I'm going to rely on is what I know about the algorithmic tools and understand their inner workings. And I know that if the data is low dimensional, that I'm going to get certain empirical signatures if I apply spectral and conversely flow. And if the data is an expander, which, when data is not linear, machine learners say I want to make it a manifold or something, which is basically low dimensional space that's bent around. I mean, the least like a low dimensional thing is an expander. And so you might ask, how does spectral behave there and how does flow behave there? So if you believe there's communities and you have some intuition that at size scale 500, 1,000, 10,000, there's some sort of community-like things where there's good intra-mass relative to inter-mass, then you're not combinatorially, but sort of intuitively, and certainly if you had noise, intuitively doing something sort of low-dimensional. And so that might be something you could expect that you could cull out with a spectral type algorithm, whereas you damage that with flow. Whereas if you're in a very expander-like part of the graph, and there could be some residual structure there, spectra would destroy that because the diffusions would touch everything very quickly. Whereas flow, because of its artifactual inner workings, might sort of in an analogous way highlight that. So with that, let me wrap up and thank you for your attention.